Thank you very much, Wim, for your welcome. Let me just say I'm delighted to welcome you all here this morning and for this very interesting conference that Wim has just described. Let me just say in a few words, let's set the scene. And I think a brave new word is indeed a very good title, a very appropriate title. It seems to me that when you look at the banking industry, we are, at the end of the day, beyond the specific challenges of any specific business model. It seems to me that fundamentally the European banking industry is facing three common challenges. Has to deal with three common features in terms of environment. The first dimension is, it seems to me, obviously the uncertain and volatile political, economic, and financial environment. What we've just lived in the last 18 months, just to name a few of the events, the Middle East crisis, the Ukrainian crisis, the Greek crisis. From a pure financial perspective, the volatility on the markets, driven, for example, by the uncertain outcome of the central bank decisions. We are on the 17th of September, and we are all waiting, at least the markets are waiting for the decision of the Fed. And of course, of structural changes which are taking place on the markets. And may I say, even perhaps more structurally, this overall perspective of a low growth environment in developed countries and the challenge today which weighs on the emerging and developing world. All this means in the coming years maybe the same kind of environment. What we've experienced in the last 18 months, we must admit a limited capacity to anticipate, can reflect in the coming years what we could experience. And may I say, for an industry which has as a predominant role to take long-term risk, I mean 5, 10, and 15 years risk, it's a really big challenge, and which can, and that's an issue I think, because it's not necessarily that compatible with growth, that can lead to an overall conservatism. Second, may I just insist also on the fact that we are living, and we should not forget, we are living with extraordinary unconventional monetary policies. I've mentioned the Fed, but of course the ECB has also engaged in such a policy, and we should also keep in mind that the Japanese central bank is also having a very accommodative monetary policy. My personal conviction is that on one hand, if it's of course a useful stimulation for growth and to stop disinflation anticipation, at the same time, it creates also certain distortions, and at some point should end, and it is likely that it could end, of course, in the next 5 years, which will be, of course, one element in terms of designing strategy. Can I just say, of course, that when I just look at the items at stake, I mean, what we can already forecast, there is this perspective of a referendum in the UK, of whether the UK will stay in Europe, and which I can already imagine the nervousness around this debate. That's the first dimension. The second dimension is obviously still the uncertain, may I say unpredictable, and certainly demanding regulatory environment. We are going to enter more in details in the different panels, I'm sure about that. Let me just name all the dimensions around the structural reforms, the question of organization of banks and resolution. Can I just mention the capital and liquidity requirements? Can I just mention, too, everything around compliance? And as we all know, there are many dimensions in that topic. What I just would like to say is, for CEOs of any bank, I would say that in such an uncertain environment in terms of regulatory demand, it is very difficult to strike the right balance, and again looking at the long term, in terms of strategy and the balance between your ambitions in terms of growth, your need in terms of enhancing capital ratios, and of course, your policy in terms of dividend payment. And at the end of the day, we remain with one challenge, common challenge, which will be also discussed, I'm sure, by my colleagues, which is the profitability challenge. And may I say, it's a bit frustrating that we've not been able, at the end of the day, to have also, to a certain extent, a certain clarity on what could be acceptable, what can be the end game, including from a supervisory and regulation perspective. With one key element to keep in mind, I personally do not consider that any economic sector can survive if the profitability, on one hand, does not enable this sector to invest and grow, and have a capacity to recruit talents in a world of competition for talents, and on one hand, of course, to attract capital, which is needed to finance the economy. The third dimension is, of course, the digital technology. Same thing, we are going to enter more in detail, and I expect a lot from the contribution of the EBF. In a nutshell, I consider it is probably today the most challenging operational objective for any CEO. I've observed myself how in the last 2 years this topic has moved towards number one in the agenda of CEOs. And I think that it is fair to say that on one hand it might be disruptive, at least for certain activities, and I would say in particular it seems to me on the retail banking side with B2C relationship. And at the same time, it also seems to me that the challenge is to manage the transition period, which might not be that short. I think that we see the change of behaviors of clients, but at the same time, I'm not convinced personally that everybody will go will be happy to have just online services in 2 years' time, which is in itself, for CEOs, a managerial and operational challenge. Without entering more in details in these three dimensions, which will be extensively discussed, I just would like to tell you, at the end of the day, that it seems to me that in order to succeed in the next 5 to 10 years, beyond what you can achieve in terms of performance on a quarterly basis, there are a few necessary elements for key success factors. The first one is to try really to select businesses which make sense, at least as much as you can anticipate. I mean by this, which provides added value to clients, which fits with the framework of the financing of the economy where we know that there will be more disintermediation. it is a given. It will be the consequence of the regulatory framework which is put in place. And third, at the end of the day, a capacity to remain agile, to face transformation, and like any company, may I say, with established business model, the capacity to attract talents. And from that perspective, at the end of the day, it might be even the more daunting challenge, how to compete with other industries, with other form of companies. Startups, of course, we all know are very much are attractive for young talents. I consider personally that from that perspective, we cannot just think that having boring stories and utility will ensure survival in this world. Let me just conclude by saying that the ambition of the EBF under Wim's leadership is really to be a trusted partner in the discussions which will still take place and have to take place. At the end of the day, to try to design what do we want for the European banking sector in 10 years' time. And we need to have this strategic industrial dialogue with one conviction that I have also clearly in my mind, that Europe has to have ambition in this sector. And when I compare with other sectors, which are so strategic, such as the telecommunications sector, where at the end of the day today, it is probably fair to say, at least it is the way I think companies, European companies see it. So far, we have in practice a fragmented sector in Europe, which is facing a challenging competition in the US, whether it's traditional players, but which have consolidated in a large market, or whether it's newcomers like the GAFAs. With everything which is at stake, if you consider that it's true that there is an issue of competitiveness, may I say, I would not like to see the same thing for the banking sector, the financial sector. And having lived myself the crisis in 2011, having seen in period of crisis how perception can be distorted versus reality, and having in my mind clearly how significant are capital markets going forward, the capacity to drive savings, and the word of influence, you know, in this world is very important when you think about a worldwide investor base. I consider the financing sector is strategic, and we are committed as banks, we are committed as a federation to ensure that we are able to adapt, that we are able to compete, and that we are able to finance growth in the coming years, because at the end of the day, the growth is probably needed to maintain and further enhance the trust and credibility in our European project of our citizens and companies. That's what I wanted to just say as an introduction, but I think we'll have a great day. I would like to thank all the teams of the EBF for their daily commitment to that. I would like to thank Wim for his also strong involvement and faith in our industry. I would like to also thank my colleague, Pianora Kopi, who is, as you know, chairman of the executive board, and of course, José María Roldan, who, as a vice president, will second me in this capacity to carry the voice of the industry and, of course, engage in this dialogue. I've been already too long, and I now let the floor to the next intervention on conduct and culture. Thank you very much.